Thank you, Leila, for a fascinating presentation, which very powerfully tells us that we have to take action now on migration. Now, I'm going to be looking at one particular section of migratory movements, and that's irregular migration, which I feel is a particularly important issue for development. Now, we just heard that there are going to be serious gaps in worker availability in Europe and North America and the rich South as the age of the population changes and fertility levels remain low. According to one estimate, there'll be a shortfall of about 50 million workers by 2060, but we just heard that this might be as high as 66 million. At the same time, the working age population in the South will increase, and there will be an inevitable flow of migrants. So that's the backdrop. Now, irregular migration is quite a significant proportion of migratory flows. There are roughly 300 to 500,000 entrants a year. That's the flows, which we should be concerned about. And the stocks in the UK are around 725,000, according to LSE estimates. That's the most recent ones that I've seen. So we're talking about large numbers of people who basically come and end up in low-skilled and low-paid jobs. Now, there are quite distinct streams of this kind of migration, linking specific regions and countries, and there's some examples here. For example, the migration from Latin America to Spain, or Ghana to the Netherlands, Senegal to France, and these have historical reasons, cultural reasons, or simply because of proximity or established historical trade routes and communication. Now, numbers of irregular migrants have been increasing. There may have been, and there probably has been, a drop in numbers with the economic downturn, but this is unlikely to be a permanent trend, and most probably numbers will have already started picking up as recovery happens. So the long-term forecast is that numbers are likely to keep on increasing, and experience has shown that tighter border controls haven't been very effective, although this seems to be the strategy followed in receiving countries. And in fact, now the thinking is, in some quarters, that tighter controls actually make people stay on longer than they would have done if controls were more lax, because they fear that they won't gain admission again once they go back to their home countries. Now, we see a similar situation in South-South and cross-border border and internal migration as well. We've been doing a lot of work on that in ODI, where you basically have a similar kind of dynamic. There are rich areas and countries who need more workers, and there are poor countries and regions who have a surplus of workers, and that is the economic reason for the movement. There are, of course, other cultural and historical reasons. And there are fears that uncontrolled migration will create chaos and threaten infrastructure and create political instability. Now, undocumented migrants, I meant to say irregular migrants here, actually, because these terms are often used synonymously, but actually I prefer the term irregular migrants, suffer from exclusion and human rights violations because they have very few rights at the destination. They cannot access pro-poor schemes. They don't have access to social protection programs, and they're often employed on terms and conditions which violate international labor standards and labor laws in the countries and regions where they work. Now, here are some examples of major irregular migration streams and numbers. For example, in Thailand, there are an estimated 2 million irregular migrants from countries in the region. In India, there are an estimated 20 million irregular migrants from Bangladesh, and there are lots of concerns about the security implications of that, apart from the competition over scarce resources. In China, there are roughly 200 million floating migrants, the so-called floating population, many of whom are irregular in the sense that they don't have contracts and they're not documented. And they come from the poorer western parts of the country to the industrial belt in the coast. In India also there are huge numbers of circular migrants, and I should say here that there are very few formal data sources on these migrants, and I'll come to that point later. There are roughly 100 million circular migrants in India, many of whom are irregular again, who work in these low-paid, low-skilled jobs in farming, in the industries, in urban areas, and they come from poor, rain-fed villages across the country. And there's similar concentrated movements of irregular migrants within West Africa, from West Africa to North Africa, and within Southern Africa as well, going into South Africa from surrounding areas. So what has the past experience of policies been to control this kind of migration, or to create a sort of temporary migration, managed migration situation? Now we know of two past programs that have widely been regarded as only partially successful or even failures. One was the German guest worker program and the US Bracero program. And the analysis suggests that it was very difficult to enforce them or to limit the stay of workers under these programs, because people tend to stay after their work comes to an end, or it's very difficult to limit a person to an economic role alone and not actually look at what rights and entitlements they have or how much they're integrated into the society there. And it also creates distortion in the receiving labor market, which starts to then work on receiving such external workers on a regular basis. And also in the sending countries, there's a dependency, because the incomes in the sending households and countries and regions then become very dependent on foreign employment. So from all these points of view, these programs haven't been very successful. However, there is renewed interest in some kind of temporary migration program, and particularly circular migration, which is quite different from temporary migration, because it actually means giving workers the freedom to come and go within certain limits. And there has been interest in this. For example, in 2007, the European Commission proposed to develop some directives for highly qualified migrants, seasonal workers, and trainees with trainee contracts. And this would give them temporary resident rights and privileged re-entry. But there are still concerns. Certain analysts and commentators have said that how do we know that this can actually create a situation where people do go back? And will this not put downward pressure on wages and create unemployment and brain drain in the sending areas? And of course there are new fears about terrorism and political instability, overcrowding, and cultural identities. So there is a need for more information on circular migration, and there are a number of past experiences and current pilot programs that we can learn from. So there's a need for improved data on circular migration, because data is a big problem, especially with irregular migration. There are no reliable data sources. And it's important to actually piece together the available information, map the major streams, streams that happened in the past, new migration streams as they're developing now, and disaggregate them by education, skill levels, gender, and also ethnic groups to better understand who these new migrants are and what their background is. And apart from the economic aspects of migration, there's a need to understand the social and environmental dimensions of circular migration, because particularly in the case of irregular migrants, social networks are very, very important. And it's very important to understand how these social networks have worked in the past and how they're likely to shape future migration patterns. Also, on the environmental side, we now have a whole new dimension to consider, which is climate change and how this is likely to shape migration flows. And there are now a number of exercises internationally and at the national level to try and project migration flows, but more work needs to be done on that because of the shortfall in data. So it's important to understand how past climate shocks and stresses have shaped migration patterns and how these are likely to develop in the future based on that past understanding. And finally, it's important to also develop social protection for vulnerable groups of migrants. So first, we need to understand who the migrants are and who the particularly vulnerable groups of migrants are, and then to devise social protection programs for them. And there is a lot of thinking going on this at present. Leila also mentioned pension and healthcare programs in her paper and how these might be structured in the future. So it's quite important to start and review and analyze the available information from the point of view of the most vulnerable irregular migrants. And as I said, there are some schemes that we can actually examine in greater detail and learn from the experience. Such as bilateral agreements and pilot initiatives on migrant support services. For example, the Western Balkans has initiated migrant support service. The IOM has initiated migrant support services in the Western Balkans, and the ILO conducted a 13-country study in Africa a few years ago on managing labor migration as an instrument for development. So lessons can be learned from that experience. And there are new developments that we need to watch, like this recent Swedish policy on circular migration, which is very demand-driven, where employers decide who they want and how long they can stay for, and the permit to stay in Sweden is renewed if the worker still has a contract. Their families can come and work. The World Bank is also piloting projects, I believe, on circular migration in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And then within countries, there are policies and programs to watch out for and learn from, and we're working on that, like Chinese urban policy reform and Indian migrant support programs, and also Vietnamese policies for rural urban migrants. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.